So, Ethan, I know I have a lot of these, but I might have a theoretical moral dilemma.
Let's hear it.
So, I'm opposed to the idea of the government giving out free money, right? Like, that's objectively terrible for the economy.
Okay, go on.
But President-elect Joe Biden wants to send me $2,000 and my wife $2,000.
Okay, so there's a really simple way to solve this one.
Should I give it to you?
Well, yeah. I was just going to say accept it, but I'm definitely not opposed to the idea. I could use that.
I know, couldn't we all? I mean, honestly, it's not really a moral dilemma, but I do think it's terrible for the economy. I mean, we're like, there's no way this is not going to come back to bite us with inflation.
Well, I mean, if you're giving $2,000 to every eligible American, then that should stimulate the economy because it's going to cause more spending.
Right, but it's also watering down the value of the dollar, and we're going to see prices skyrocket, and we don't have anything backing our money anyway, and now we're printing more money. Like there's a limit to just how much value fiat money can hold.
And I'm sure we could go on about this for the rest of the time, but we've got an even more pressing topic to discuss today, which is
resolved. On balance, the benefits of urbanization in West Africa outweigh the harms.
I love this one. I'm excited about this one.
I know. Urbanization, West Africa, a clear weighing resolution. What's not to love?
And we worked on this one yesterday in the debate elective. We got, I think, 2.5 pages of cards cut so far, something like that. And there's a lot of interesting avenues to take with this one. It's like clearly a globalization topic. How is West Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa going to fit into the global economy? But there's so many specific things to be considered. This is like, if you imagine the American Industrial Revolution, right, is associated with urbanization and people moving to cities. And then you just have the whole thing done over in a different country. What did we see from there? What did we see from industrialization in Europe that we could tweak to make this the best possible process for urbanization in West Africa? What does it look like when you start completely over?
Which is, of course, a planner's dream to have like a blank canvas, but you can't just be all pie in the sky with this. We've also got to keep in mind the unique conditions of West Africa, the problems that urbanization without lots and lots of capital carries, and the dangers of foreign encroachment. And what happens if China is funding all of this? Like, there's a lot to do. I think this is a surprisingly interesting resolution.
It's surprisingly interesting and surprisingly broad, but not broad in the bad sense that we would usually accuse a resolution of being broad in. Like this is broad with the potential for actually well-developed arguments in several different avenues for resolutions. So super happy with this one for a public forum one. I actually like this one.
I agree. Let's start with our due diligence on definitions. I think key terms that leap out to me, of course, are on balance.
Definitely.
We've got an initial weighing framework, and we have a benefits, harms is the sides of the scale.
Right.
We have literally the verb outweigh. Our subject here is, the technical grammatical subject is benefits, but what we're actually talking about is urbanization in West Africa. I've seen a couple different sites. Trying to figure out how precise West Africa is. I know you were saying yesterday it's generally Sub-Saharan Africa.
I think that's what's going to get it watered down to.
It probably is, but I do think it's worth just keeping in mind that at least geographically there is a pretty distinct region or group of countries that are like the western half of Sub-Saharan Africa. We are dealing more with probably Cameroon than we are with Kenya, for example. I mean, because there's Central African countries, there are Eastern African countries. So I think we are dealing with those Sub-Saharan countries that are distinctively on the western, not really a panhandle, but the western knob section of the African continent. So any other thoughts on, are those about it for key terms?
Definitions are so nice in this resolution, so simple. I mean, and my mind, of course, is going straight to LD. It's like, well, there's consequentialism would be a perfect way, like perfect value here, or like, utilitarianism, but no, we're not doing that, and it's kind of just implied, which is even better, right? So you get rid of the whole framing in the LD sense and get to move it more to the public forum sense, which is nice. And again,
right, because there is still framing, but it's not. I was just reading an article a couple of debaters put out about LD theory, which is really policy theory, that's crept into LD, now creeping into public forum. We're not really advocating anything like that. I'm not suggesting that debaters should carve out one of their precious 4 minutes in the one really constructive speech don't worry about giving a framing necessarily, but I do think there are some implicit framing considerations that are packed into that idea of urbanization that we probably ought to spend a moment on.
Yeah, urbanization in West Africa. And I think that neither of these you're going to need to dig terribly far to get a solid definition for. I would just go, Merriam-Webster, knock out urbanization, find a good definition for West Africa. Don't feel obligated to list off every single country that's involved in West Africa, because you could just go to the predicate of the resolution and be like, okay, which ones are urbanizing? That's probably the ones the resolution's talking about.
A quick Google search turned up several different sites that have listed these booming cities in West Africa.
And the pictures are so cool. They're so cool.
Well, we may have been we must be looking at different sites, because I saw some that are clearly beneficiaries of a lot of capital investment.
Yes.
But others that are these miles and miles of shanty towns
Yes.
and slums. I don't remember which city it was, but one city recognizably has one of the largest slums in the world with 4 million inhabitants of a slum. All right, so part of this, I think, is really interesting, in that you have part of what's going on with Africa in the 21st century is that Africa is sort of leaping a lot of the periodic economic development that has been noted in Western countries, where, if you'll pardon me for a brief history moment.
No, you are well pardoned.
Okay. So what you have going on in really particularly in Britain and then eventually in the United States, you have this clear movement from an agrarian society to an industrialized society to an urban society, and then eventually to a whatever we're in now, which
information economy.
I was thinking technocratic.
Yeah.
I like information economy. Current theorists have called this something like the fourth industrial revolution. I saw that phrase in one of the articles yesterday. Africa is sort of leapfrogging a lot of that, where what you get in the Americans' kind of method of industrialization was moments where it seemed like people were flocking to the cities, but then those cities systematically built up in terms of roads and hospitals and train stations and airports and all of the infrastructure that makes a city work, which there's so much behind the scenes stuff that honestly, I have no idea how plumbing got built, but I'm really glad that it did. Mm-hmm. And without someone in the city planning office keeping up with, okay, we have 100,000 more people here. Do we have enough septic tanks in this section of the county? We could literally be flooded with poop and pee without those kinds of things in place. What you have going on in Africa is you have very lopsided development throughout the continent. And particularly in Western Africa, you have this movement from a largely agrarian economy that struggles with huge natural disasters and famine when there are sustained periods of drought and so on, to now suddenly mass movement to cities where there is opportunity. But the problem with that kind of mass urbanization movement is that you don't have the infrastructure building up to accommodate, say, 10 million more humans living within 80 square miles or something like that.
And the entire question that this resolution is asking is, despite all of those extenuating circumstances, extra circumstances that Africa has to deal with, is urbanization still worth it? And the main place my mind goes to is like, how do you say no to that in the long term? Like, is that implying that Africa should sort of go back to an all agrarian society and remain that way for the rest of time? Or like, if you say that the harms outweigh the benefits, then are you insinuating that we should go back, or we should stay where we are? Like, that doesn't seem like a really great place either. What's negatives reach? I guess you could say, like, what's the, not solvency, but what are you doing if you're just halting progress? Like, what are you supposed to do?
Well, I mean, for starters, I would start with, on con, recognizing that the con side does not have the burden to assert a negative solvency in a way.
I guess, yeah.
I don't have to say what Africa should do instead. My only burden on con is to show that actually harms outweigh the benefits.
That just seems like a cliffhanger. Like, that just seems like incomplete.
Welcome to human life as we're changing circumstances. I mean, like, honestly, now, I've already been a history teacher on this episode. I'll be a literature teacher for a moment. If you want to get kind of a good grasp on kind of the harms of fast industrialization, nothing beats Charles Dickens' novel Hard Times and its description of mill towns in the 19th century. where you get really fast capitalistic growth that has zero concern for human quality of life. And so I think that's part of where I would go on con, is to consider, okay, the dream of huge economic growth is really enticing, but at what cost? So how many people, if I'm going to move to the big city, the risk is that I'm going to be one of 1 million, 2 million people who are never going to have my big break. Maybe I am one of those ones who gets a big break, but am I going to even have a sustainable quality of life in that? Or am I just going to be lost in the grist?
I like it. So, I mean, I'm a little dissatisfied with the negative position, just being like, the harms outweigh the benefits. Like, oh well. I mean, but if the benefits outweigh the harms, like, yeah, keep urbanizing. You kind of like have somewhere to attach that to, action-based in your head. But again, that's not the way debate plays out in the real world. And
Right.
it feels not right, but that's just a reminder to the negative, to establish your burdens and don't let people push you to act on the negative side. You're just pushing to negate the affirmative side, essentially, and outweigh. That's your obligation. Your obligation isn't
Right.
to prove anything different, even though that's what most people's heads might go to.
I mean, I think your benefits are relatively straightforward. We're talking about, there's a basketball game right next to
Yeah,
us. We're in
that's
my
bothering
classroom
me.
today, and I'm not going to edit this out. So just in case anybody's like, what's happening?
Just pretend like they're clapping for us.
That's right. Also, our team must be winning. I can't see the score, but I'm sure we're winning. Anyway, I would assert that the benefits are probably going to be a bit more individualistic and economic in nature, but your harms are probably going to be systemic and are going to be, you have access to a lot more environmental harms, I would imagine. If anybody listening particularly loves ecology or biology, you could probably get some great stuff about the unique ecosystems of West Africa, and then the way urbanization is destroying those ecosystems. That can give you access. I'm sure there's a climate change link just begging to be like picked up and cuddled close by like every debater ever on con for this resolution.
So how about we start thinking about some specific directions, I guess you could say, on affirmative and negative. Let's start with affirmative. What does your mind automatically run to? Maybe 2-3 arguments that would be good when you think of benefits of urbanization in West Africa.
Probably my initial thought there is going to be, I might look at spread of democracy and establishment of rule of law. As I'm drawing this mostly from a history class I took on modern 20th century African history. One of the big problems with Africa has been the continuation of big man rule, where tribal leaders are still the ones who can organize armed forces and maintain power in a dictatorial way. And then you also get those same leaders then become the ones who are involved in kind of running the political system as it stands. And then, so the twin problems of big man rule and corruption are endemic to African politics. Well, one of the interesting things that tends to happen as you get to larger urban centers is that those sorts of particular local personality-driven power politics, they change. It's not that they disappear, but they are less prevalent. And what you get instead are less personal, more systematic approaches that tend towards the increase of rule of law. So I would see that as a major gain. You could also certainly look at, I don't know this. I think you might be about to read us some evidence.
I've got cards
Good.
packed up behind
We'll get
me.
to some in just a second, but you could certainly also look at increases in education, increases in access to hospitalization and modern medical care, increases in sort of the access to the global economy that a city allows that really tribal or town level living doesn't do. So all of those are areas I would look at pro. What other sides would you look to, Ethan?
I think the pro needs to take, surprisingly in this debate, the more strong-fisted approach. You usually see con being like, in the status quo, it's like, even though these harms may exist on the pro side, I should still win because it's almost like you just have to suck it up because the status quo is better and that plan won't work. The pro in this case, I think, has to be more of the suck it up sort of side. Like it's like growing pains essentially, which is a very, very euphemistic way to put it because urbanization can have some seriously negative effects. But if you're ever going to progress to the goal of tapping into the global economy, which is literally like liquid gold to a developing country, then you're going to, it's going to hurt. Like there's going to be growing pains. There's going to be inequalities that are created that exist in a capitalistic society that unless there's constraints put on it, which I would argue that wouldn't necessarily work anyways, the definition of a growing capitalist society is that inequalities are created, some will move up higher than others. And that's just sort of the approach that I think affirmative will need to swallow, in a sense, in order to gain access to some of those benefits.
So too tangential, possibly too theoretical to really be valuable in this kind of PF round. Thoughts off of that. Did you see the movie Black Panther?
Yes.
Which, as a side note,
such a good movie.
The actor who plays the King of Wakanda just passed away last year, Chad somebody.
Yeah.
Did you know he was an NSDA guy?
You said that to me. Yeah, you did
he was
point that out. That was great.
He did dramatic interp at nationals back in the 90s.
That is
I was
so
just like,
cool.
I love finding like famous people who do this and like, ha! Look at that! This is not
Maybe
just
we'll
some
be
nerdy
famous
thing.
one day.
Oh my goodness, that would be weird. Anyway, one of the things I thought was fascinating about Black Panther was that you see Black Panther shows you a really interesting Wakanda where you have an African country that is clearly higher than normal Western countries in terms of its technology. And you see sort of this blend of ecological responsibility and technological superiority in the design of their city. Well, Wakanda there, in a sense, is a dream. Like, there are no African cities that actually look like that. But I think there'd be an interesting argument to be made on pro that urbanization is the way that West African countries can take their place in the global community through attracting investment and developing natural industries. They can do that, but on the flip side, and I see you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, just for something small, but yeah.
Okay, on the flip side, and again, Neg would need to figure out how on earth to make this actually stick. But you could I think there's an interesting argument to be made there from a post-colonialist critical theory position to basically argue that our picture of a successful city is basically based on London and Paris, and it's a vision that the colonialist imperializing forces sort of established.
You gave it to them. Now they're going to run with it.
If anybody's looking for that sort of
why is it so wrong to just look at a city that did well and just be like, yeah, there you go, like, well done, London, or I don't know. I just have to be post-colonialist.
Oh, by no means am I encouraging anyone to be post-colonialist, but I do think the argument is there, and at least you didn't ask, but I'm gonna go ahead and give it. My position on like post-colonialist theory is that it's really easy to misapply. But there are very few places where you are dealing with a place that used to be ruled by a colonialist power, and how you interpret that location's dreams of itself is inextricable from the colonialization in its past.
Yeah, agreed. They're totally good.
This is a place where I do see a little bit of place for this. That like when you're dealing with West African countries, you can't deal with Algeria is not really one of them, but it's the one that I know enough about to make the argument. You can't deal with Algeria without France in its history.
Yeah.
So Algerian identity is tied to the French language and French culture in a unique way. So I think if you're dealing with West Africa, you do also have to deal with the fact that like our mental picture as Westerners, as Americans, is fundamentally shaped by Western cities. What would an African city that was not shaped by those Western concepts look like? I don't know the answer to that question.
That'd be I'd love to see like some book, like creative author sort of write.
I would imagine if anybody's listening and wants to check this out, I would look at some of the African Union resources and see, I am surely someone has kind of put together a uniquely African vision of a city. But it's also important to keep in mind that even our name African, much like the name Indian, is itself a very large construct. There was in the 1950s, there was an American ethnologist who tried to who created a map. It's a fascinating color-coded map where it's all different shades of red to create a sense of unity, but each tribe gets a different shade of red. There's over 500 different tribes on this one continent that I think the Portuguese named it first, and they were just like, Africa. That whole landmass is Africa. So when you talk about African unity, that's in itself is also a construct in a very real way. you actually deal with African politics, you've got every country has its colonial past, but also the indigenous tribes that make it up, people who moved around, different language groups, and then different religious groups as well. And all of that makes this huge, complicated, beautiful mess.
Massive cultural diversity. It's like
Huge,
maybe you can get
huge.
away with naming the massive landmass. Like, okay, this geographic area on the map is Africa, but when you look at it, I mean, the whole decentralized, like it couldn't be more different.
There's a long-standing argument that northern Africa, north of the Sahara, is basically southern Europe, in that given that it was part of the Roman Empire and tied to the Mediterranean world. But anyway, we are digressing very far from the resolution.
That was fun, and yeah, I think it's definitely worth pointing out the post-colonialist approach to that. And if any resolution could have it applied well, it's definitely this one.
Though again, debaters, please, evidence matters way more than having like a cool theory point in public forum. So weight your evidence and value your time, because you have a precious 4 minutes to make your case.
To sort of like put a golden bow on whatever that affirmative like rant was, look towards the dream, look towards what Africa could be based on what it is. Like, again, that whole sort of spiel we went on about what exactly does it mean to say that Africa is Africa, the different tribal groups. I was actually going to make a point about the natural resources. We talk about Africa, maybe it's not vibranium like it is in Wakanda, but Africa has access to massive amounts of natural resources that give it like great potential in the global market, especially as globalization is now like the big story of the modern world, essentially. There's great potential for Africa to grow as a whole in terms of wealth, and for it to be better for all of the citizens. It's just going to take some time to get there, and hopefully the right constraints on that growth. That's a cool water bottle. The right constraints on that growth process to make it as least painful as possible and most beneficial as possible. So there's plenty of arguments to be made on affirmative there. Definitely economic, definitely individual, and the affirmative is going to need to be ready to defend against all of those little nitpicky things that the neg is going to say. It's like, well, what about climate? What about slums? What about this? It's like, well, yeah, everything good comes at a cost. It's like you're not just going to get this perfect. I mean, just look at what happened in Europe and America, industrialization, like child labor, all of these like dangerous factories to work in. The natural progression of this sort of thing happens to be where you sort of get a chaotic push forward, and then, morality is an afterthought. It's like, okay, let's reel it in a little bit, but it's never control it as it goes. It's always like, okay, like we've busted through, we've got all of this progress. Some people are getting, making fortunes for the next 4 generations of their family, and then we need to reel it in a little bit and think about how are we going to get this accessible to the rest of society. If that's the nature of how urbanization, industrialization, wealth building through capitalism goes, and it's sort of inevitable, then maybe there's a way that we can account for that on affirmative, or maybe it's just too negative of a process overall, which is where we need to harp on con. And I've realized that every card on this entire document is a con card. So you'll have no trouble finding evidence for the con side. A couple of the popular points you're going to run into is Sub-Saharan Africa urbanization increases susceptibility to climate change. When you have everybody packed into one area with whatever sort of structural integrity of the buildings that currently exist in Africa is lacking adequate infrastructure to deal with this sort of thing. When you talk about things like flood insurance and stuff like that, just all of the things that you kind of take for granted in the developed world when it comes to dealing with these sorts of things, responses from the government, like, Red Cross, all this stuff that we think about in the United States. You need to put it in a context of the climate that Africa has on a yearly basis, and think about, well, if we're urbanizing, we're packing all these people into one area, can we support them when disaster strikes, which is more common in that area? I mean, that's where all hurricanes form, is right on the lower part, right next to Africa, right? So that's one thing to think about, the economic damages. One resource I found was from CSIS website, which I don't even know what that stands for. We could even put the PDF in the link, or not in the link, in the comments if we wanted to. I could read the card as I cut it. It says urban centers lacking access to adequate infrastructure are more likely to be impacted by natural disasters. It cites the World Bank from 2013, gives an example of Dakar, so it seems like a pretty decent overview of what what natural disaster would look like in the context of sub-Saharan Africa and urbanization.
Well, we have lots of examples, too, of the United States of just how difficult it is for cities when natural disasters strike and how much effort it takes to rebuild. I'm thinking of New Orleans, and I think Houston had Had huge flooding a couple years ago. I mean, it takes enormous resources, and mobilization of the surrounding country and government, different governmental forces to come in, both private and public, to kind of rebuild. And in the absence of those, that kind of devastation can wipe out decades of economic progress in mere weeks.
Right. And I've got another one. We mentioned slums earlier. Again, I really just see this as an inevitable consequence of urbanization. It's like when you pack more people into one area, you can't. Go ahead, say something
Well,
first.
I was thinking the question there becomes, like, does urbanization, what you're looking at right now, at least the stuff I was reading yesterday about this was suggesting that part of what is needed is a lot more urban planning.
Yes.
Where what you currently have is sort of a natural movement of people where, in ways that like nobody can really track, messages spread amongst a younger generation. There's opportunity in city X. So everyone moves to city X, and then city X suddenly has an extra million people that no one ever planned for. I don't know enough about urban planning to know if it really works the way what I was reading suggested does. But the theory is that, like, if urban planning is kind of structured and paced out, the resources to support those people can be done as the population grows, but that requires massive capital investment up front.
Right. And is that something that we're expecting to happen naturally in Africa's sort of decentralized economy as it is now? Or are we expecting Western countries to, give capital investment? I'm not saying make a whole plan out of this, but think about the context. What happens to money that's sent to Africa? I think there's a corruption argument, right?
There's a very clear
corruption argument to be made in there. Yeah. There's actually a card in here for that too. But the one about slums, also from the same PDF that I talked about before, talks about how as of 2014, 55% of sub-Saharan Africa urban population were living in slums. So the majority of sub-Saharan African population living in slums as of, I guess it's 2014. So a little outdated, trying to find some new numbers. I could even expect it to be higher if there's more urbanization. And this process hasn't reversed into a more productive state yet. You could still see more people living in slums. Find some impacts for that. It's super easy to just say the word slum and move on. It's a lot different to actually draw out a picture of what dire poverty looks like in the wake of urbanization. There's a good term for it also, is urban sprawl, that is talked a lot about. You could literally just type in sub-Saharan African urban sprawl and find a ton of resources, a ton of cards that talk about famine, the inability to distribute food when you pack a ton of people into one area. And keep in mind, when you're urbanizing and people are coming to the cities for economic opportunities, that reduces the amount of agricultural production in the surrounding areas, and it takes a while to strike a balance between the two. So all of these things, consequences of urbanization, can we just implement city planner and fix it all? I don't know.
I mean, but that too goes to that goes to another difficulty that African countries have had, again, for decades. And the question is, like, as you move into a contemporary economy, let's just take the problem of airplane construction, for example. It takes an immense amount of preparation for someone to know how to build an airplane and to have aerospace engineers who can design, who can continue improving aircraft and so on. Well, how do you get that? Well, part of that is building the educational infrastructure that equips people to be at the cutting edge of that. But you also need a surrounding economy that has enough mobility and financial resources to enable people to get to the point where they could become an airplane engineer or whatever that high-level job is. So how do you get that in an urban economy without already having all of those components in place? Like, it becomes really tricky. So I'm not trying to suggest it's like, if this city just had an urban planner, all the problems would go away. Instead, just think about we have a doctor shortage in the United States right now. There's no shortage of medical programs in universities. There's an immense shortage of money to help people go get the medical degrees that they want, and a huge problem of physician burnout because they're graduating with so much debt, they have to go work for companies they don't want to work for. So they burn themselves out in 10 years, pay off their loans, and have an MD, but are done being doctors. Well, so what do you do with, you have this many millions of people and now disease is spreading throughout the city, but you don't have the resources to deal with it? All of that becomes really tricky.
The trick, I guess, is time. Time, investment, planning. making mistakes. That's sort of the cycle, the
Right.
way it works in the rest of the world. And I guess it could look different because now we have a globalized economy where perhaps we could learn some lessons from what's happened in other areas. But that's not to say that all of the problems will simply be solved by looking at previous examples. I mean, it's
Right, 'cause
literally
you're dealing-
building an entire new network that's going to plug into the global
Right.
economy eventually. So
Now,
it's a big
one
question.
other, and I think we focus mostly on theory on pro, as we haven't researched pro yet, but one other con argument that I think could be made in a really interesting way. I've been interested in the human trafficking question with particularly, it's a global problem, but a lot of that runs through Africa and Asian countries. I found one website that was looking at it's not a huge percentage, less than 10% of human trafficking runs through West African countries. But of the human trafficking that happens in West Africa, the vast majority of it is forced labor and forced marriages. So it's not like sex trafficking into brothels or things like that. That's a problem in different countries. Here, it's much more this cultural practices that they're definitely out of line with mainstream Western values and the general consensus view of human rights. So part of what you've also got to deal with, I think there's a pro and con argument here. On pro, if you can find evidence linking urbanization to an increased view of human rights and a decrease in these objectively bad things like forced human servitude or slavery, that's a bad thing.
Yeah.
If you can show that urbanization leads to the decline in that could be a solid argument.
There's a super, super strong trend and correlation, connection, whatever you want to call it, between increased wealth in a country and an increased perception of human rights. You could look to the United States, the creation of the United Nations, and the whole doctrine on human rights that it's outlined. There's a lot of benefits you can connect to human rights, and there's a lot of benefits you can connect to building wealth in a society, period. But to sort of give negative or a con, a way to come back from that is, don't just assume getting richer makes things better. And first of all, don't just assume that urbanization is going to get you richer. And I think one of the coolest ways to get at that is actually with the climate argument, talking about putting all of these people in one area. There is literally not even close to enough resources to accommodate for natural disaster with urbanization. We deal with this better in the agrarian society with people spread out at least. And there's not all this, infrastructure to rebuild, or what infrastructure we do have, how are we going to get it back? How are we going to make sure that every year our progress isn't being knocked backwards or even taking steps in the negative direction to making urbanization effective, eliminating slums? This isn't just a simple rising tide lifts all boats. There's still restrictions on, total free market in Africa. There's government corruption in Africa that hinders the process. So Khan needs to dig into the specifics of what is Western Africa's situation, and how is X, Y, and Z factor, corruption, climate, slums, you have it, going to affect urbanization in West Africa? You need to be ultra specific, not abusively ultra specific, but ultra specific on con, so that pro can't just run away with a wealth human rights argument, or wealth that rising tide lifts all boats. Everybody's going to be richer, plugged into the global economy, all of that stuff. There's too many general arguments to be made on pro. Focus on the specifics on con, I think, is the best strategy for con. And for pro, anything?
I think for a pro, focus on the fact that since I shelled out a post-colonialist argument, I'll give the response to it. On pro, I think you need to focus on the fact that this is Africa's opportunity to really develop a whole new future that really is unforeseen, where Africa is the leading center of global cities, and there's a whole new realm of human possibilities. I think there's interesting arguments to be made. There's plenty of people who have talked about the fact that people are actually the greatest resource on the planet. And so that as you gather people together in cities, you multiply the possibilities of what can be accomplished. So really, as you're increasing urbanization, you're increasing future possibilities. So what you may end up having is that Khan has a ton of specific impacts that they can give you. They can give you measurable, quantifiable data on. But what I think pro can do it's hard. It's very hard to make this kind of argument work. But if you can make it work, it's fantastic. If Pro can really spell out the ability to create future possibilities and the fact that those are as infinite as human creativity is, you can create an answer in response, and you can win with a greater number of future possibilities against a bunch of future negative consequences.
Essentially just saying don't halt progress just because it hurts. Just because there's harms associated with
Kind
something
of. I like
doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it.
Yeah, I like your growing pains analogy. I think that's effective.
It's a little bit too light, but it does work. I
think
guess
it
this
can,
analogy. Yeah.
I think it can work. Honestly, I think that's everything I can think to say on
Just don't on
urbanization.
Pro, don't relinquish draw out the benefits of globalization, right? Like, I mean, in the past, you wouldn't recognize it as globalization. You just recognize it as the building of a, free society, free market society. This is plugging Africa into a global network, quite literally. Like, also, if anybody's interested in Africa's version of Amazon, it's called Jumia. On the stock market, it's JMIA is the ticker symbol. It is super cool what they're doing. They're literally like Amazon and DoorDash together, just for Africa. It's kind of like the coolest thing ever. And they're publicly traded on the stock market, so if anyone's interested in investing. But I'm totally not pitching for Jumia, and no, I don't own any shares, so we're not trying to inflate the price.
Ethan stock tips.
No, don't buy that. I'm not, okay, now I actually have to do this. I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not recommending it, I just think it's a cool company to look up. But again, just to draw like a picture using Jumia as an example of all of the massive wealth, potential, opportunity, globalized gain that's sitting right in front of Africa is to be recognized and to be striven for, I would say. And that's just the nature of progress. Like, Africa's not going to look the same 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. So how are we going to harness all of the opportunity in front of us to make this the best economy that it could possibly be? And that's the nature of progress. That's how it's going to end up, whether Neg or Khan likes it or not. We're not just going to, put a peg in it. It's like, everybody go back to the farms. Like, we're just going to try doing agrarian stuff again. Like, something's going to happen. How do we best take advantage of the opportunity to make it the best outcome possible? There's so much good stuff to look towards on the pro side. And Khan, get specific. I mean, look at the specific factors in the African economy, the African environment that would possibly add extra harm to the growing pains, I guess, if you want to use the analogy. And I think this could be a really interesting resolution.
I'm going to make you read some Wendell Berry poetry about going back to the farm and embracing the good that is the agrarian lifestyle before you graduate. But that's a discussion for another day. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this episode of What's the Res. We've thoroughly enjoyed discussing West African urbanization. And hey, who knows? Maybe someday we can go visit some of these booming cities in West Africa. That would be so cool.
So cool. And if any of you have any questions, comments, anything you want to say about the episode, be sure to email us at what'sttheres@gmail.com. That's WHATSTHERES@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Reddit at what'sttheres_. And check out our website, www.what'sttheres.com. And until next time, work hard, speak well, and seek the truth.